Hello everyone, welcome again to another Ableton Live tutorial. My name is Michael and I go by the name Radio Moon, and today we're going to be talking about my absolute favorite default synth in Ableton Live, and that is Wavetable. So without further ado, let's get started. So before we get into breaking down Ableton's Wavetable instrument, we need to understand what is Wavetable Synthesis anyway. Wavetable Synthesis is a technique that generates one period or one oscillation of a waveform that can be tuned to the different notes on a keyboard. Different waveforms can be arranged adjacent to each other in a table, and then we can use different controls to modulate our position and determine which waveform is playing. A wavetable's ability to modulate between all these different waveforms is what gives these sounds their evolving quality and differentiates them from just sampling like a regular sine wave or a square wave or any other waveform. I personally like to think of it like scanning through an analog radio, and instead of choosing like a radio station, you're choosing which waveform that you want to play. So it's really fun to just sweep through the different waveforms and find one that you like. So if you want to dive into the history of wavetable synthesizers or learn more about this technique, feel free to check out some of the links that I provided below. All right, now that little history lesson is over, we can finally dive into what Wavetable can actually do. All right, so here we are again inside of Ableton, and I already have a default Wavetable patch loaded up, which is just a simple sine wave. There we go. What Wavetable is essentially a 2 oscillator synthesizer that also has a bonus sub oscillator, 2 filters, an amp envelope, 2 additional envelopes, 2 LFOs, and then a modulation matrix that we can use to route certain parameters to control anything that we want. Wavetable's power isn't only in the ability to scan these different waveforms and find cool sounds. The true power of it lies within the modulation matrix and then choosing a parameter that we want to control another one, and then that even opens up more dynamic possibilities and really allows for a lot of fun and creative sound design. I love this synth. I find myself going back to it all the time to start building a synth from scratch and use it to really create a lot of deep sounding leads and pads, and also just interesting rhythmic sounds. I just find it endlessly inspiring, and that's why I keep coming back to it. So this tutorial is going to be a little bit more in depth, and also a quick disclaimer: Wavetable was not introduced until Ableton 10. So if you have a version before that, sorry, this tutorial is not going to be for you. But if you have 10 and above, Wavetable is a default synth and it's going to be available for you to use. I also highly recommend going through Ableton's Wavetable presets to give you a full spectrum of like what this synth can actually do. It can emulate string sounds, pads, mallets, all sorts of other crazy sounds. So let's dive in and go over all the different features. Starting off, the main thing that you might notice, or what distinguishes Wavetable, is the Wavetable panel, which this is the large dark rectangle on the left side. And as we can see, there's different waveforms inside of here. First, we're starting off with just a basic sine wave. And so right to the right of the different waveforms is our Wavetable position slider, which allows us to scan through the wavetable. So then we can see we're morphing from a sine wave to a triangle to a saw to a square wave. Pretty awesome. At the top, we can see we have 2 different oscillators, and by default, the second one is turned off, and to turn it on, we can just click this little yellow square right here to turn on our second oscillator. Right below that, we have the different banks of sounds that we can choose, and they are categorized by types. We have complex, distortion, different instruments, noise, and then other vintage synthesizers. And within each of these different groups are some individual wavetables. So I also highly recommend just going through and playing and scanning through these wavetables to see all the different sonic possibilities that comes with it, and start mixing and matching them together to discover new interesting sounds. So we'll go back to basics and basic shapes for now. You can also change the look of the wavetable panel by going up to the top right and clicking this circle, which turns it into a circular wavetable shape, but I just prefer to leave it on linear. I feel like it just gives a better graphical and visual readout of what wave you're playing. You can also notice that whatever is showing up in yellow is the type of wave that is playing through the synthesizer, which is very helpful and gives a nice visual feedback to when it comes to doing your sound design, so you can get an idea of what you're kind of playing with. Below the waveforms, the wavetable panel, is the waveform effects. It defaults on modern, and we have different types of wave effects for different purposes. We have FM, which stands for frequency modulation, that you can use to add different harmonics into the wave. So we'll change the sound like this. Under classic, this uses pulse width modulation that is emulating old wavetable synthesizers. So you can see it's just shortening that length of the sine pulse or the wave pulse, and then also the sync. And lastly, modern is kind of a hybrid of classic and FM, and also in a way has its own pulse width. And then fold uses phase distortion to add interesting harmonics to the sound. So I typically don't use a whole lot of these when I'm creating sounds, but sometimes I like to modulate them slightly to add a little variation. But feel free to play around with all these different settings so you get an idea of what each one does and how it affects the sound. To the left of the wavetable panel is the sub oscillator, and you can turn that on just by clicking this sub button right here. We can adjust the gain or the level of the sub, the tone, and then also the octave in relation to the main oscillator. To the right of the wavetable panel is our filter section, and by default there's only one filter activated. And to activate the second one, you can just go up to this little yellow square right here and click it, and that turns on the second filter. And down below we can see that 1 represents the first filter position and 2 represents the second filter position, and you control these on either side. At the top you can change the filter type and the steepness, and then also inside each one of these filters there's different filter circuits. I'm not exactly sure what exactly are the differences between them, but I do know that each one of these, when you select them, enables the ability to add drive to your signal, which can add some distortion going into the filter, which is really nice for beefing up your sound. And then you can also control filter resonance and frequency. To the right of the filter section is what I was explaining before, where all the different amp envelopes, additional envelopes, LFOs, and MIDI routing can take place. So you can further customize all these different parameters and really add a lot of movement to the synthesizer. I'm going to break that down a little bit, how to control them in a bit. It can look kind of confusing and intimidating, but once you get a hang of how it works, it's pretty easy to set things up and you can quickly start making things sound a lot more complex. To the right of this modulation matrix panel, we have the global features, which is our volume. We can change it from polyphony to mono, and then we can adjust the number of voices for polyphony right here. We also have a glide and then unison. Unison will add different voices for each of the notes that you're playing, and so it kind of thickens up the sound. And the cool thing is there's different unison modes that are really fun to play with that also can add a different type of character to the sound. Below that, we have the number of voices that we can use in our unison, and then the amount that we want for the unison effect. Lastly, there's one other hidden feature that I think is so cool about Wavetable, and that is the ability to import your own waveforms into it, and Wavetable will automatically figure out what the period of those waves are so that you can just automatically play them on your synth. So let me show you how that works. So to import your own waveform, you go under this category tab and then select user. And then you're gonna see that it's gonna say drop sample here. So I'm just gonna go in to my user library and pick an audio sample from another synth that I've already created and throw it in here and see what it sounds like. I'll just go to Dawn Warmth and start playing to see what it sounds like. So you can see it's kind of automatically pitched this synth sample, and now I can scan the wavetable from this sample and just play around with different harmonics from that sound. So I think you can see that there's just almost endless creative possibility. You can choose some of the default wavetables that are already built right into the synth, or you can import your own samples from different synths that you've used or any sample and start creating your own synthesizers from that. So it's pretty amazing. So now's the time when we can finally dive in and start building a sound from scratch. So I reopened a default instance of Wavetable, and I'm going to scan through the basic shapes and choose one of these wavetables as the basis of our sound. So I'm going to go to Complex, and then let's choose Plastic Shimmer and play around with the position. So I like a lot of the harmonics in that sound. Let's say I want to adjust the wavetable position using an LFO. So under the Matrix tab, I can go under the Oscillator 1 position, go to LFO 1, and adjust the amount that the LFO will adjust the wavetable position. So let's see how that sounds. So now we can hear that the LFO is modulating the wavetable position. I can also change the rate to be synced to the LFO by clicking on this note button right here. The R stands for retrigger, which is important so that the LFO retriggers every time you hit the keys. Down below, we have the different rate of the LFO modulation. So I'm going to adjust this to 1. I can also adjust the amount that the LFO is modulating. So now it's not moving as far through the wavetable. I can also adjust the shape and choose different shapes right here, from triangle, saw, square, and more. So now let's adjust the filter frequency to be modulated by the second LFO. So I go back to the Matrix. Once I click on the filter frequency knob, it's going to show up in the Matrix, and then I can go to LFO 2 and adjust the amount. And then I'm going to turn down the frequency so that you can hear the modulation. Pretty cool. Now you can see it's pretty easy to add different parameters in the Matrix and then choose which modulation controls them. So I'm going to change this to be synced, change the rate. Pretty awesome. Another thing that I really like to do is use MIDI data as a modulation. So I'm using a push 2 and it has aftertouch built in. So any controller that has aftertouch allows you to adjust the pressure of the pad that you're pushing to control a different parameter. So under MIDI, I can go to pressure or press and then add the amount that I want to for that to control the position. So I'm going to turn off the LFO so that you can watch and see that change. So the harder I push or the higher it goes in the wavetable. So that opens up a lot of really interesting dynamics to performing the wavetable, which is pretty awesome too. And now we have a sound like this. Also, I'm going to add in a noise unison mode. You can already hear how much grit that added in texture, which I really enjoy. And lastly, I'm going to add in a sub oscillator to add some depth. I'm going to adjust the amount of the LFO on the filter frequency. And I'm going to slow it down to 2. I can also adjust the attack to be slower and the decay to be up. Now we have a really interesting and dynamic pad sound. So Wavetable is great for designing any type of sound from bass, pads, leads, and even just interesting sound effects. So feel free and get creative with all these sound design possibilities and explore mapping the different parameters to come up with really awesome, interesting, and unique results. All right, that does it for this video. I hope you learned something new about Wavetable that you can use to keep creating your own awesome synths and sound design. As always, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to them as soon as possible. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.